All right. Well, thank you and happy Throwback Thursday. Thank you for joining us. My name's Amy Mueller, and I'm a member of the wildlife team for the Sierra Club Wisconsin, and we're celebrating our Wolf Awareness Week. So I'd like to also welcome my special co-host. This is Ava Mueller. She's here for the technical issues, so we don't run into any tonight. and we're going to be hearing from two national experts on the Endangered Species Act. And before we get into that, I'll briefly run through a little bit of housekeeping for us all. If you can, please keep yourself on mute while we get rolling during the presentations. We should have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. Also, we are recording this, so we do plan to share the recording out and post to our YouTube channel after the event. And before we begin, the Sierra Club Wisconsin chapter has the privilege and the responsibility to acknowledge the Indigenous people who have called this land home for generations. This acknowledgement demonstrates our strong commitment to collaborate and partner with the sovereign tribal nations located in Wisconsin. There are 12 tribal nations that call this land home, 11 which are federally recognized. No matter where we are in the state, you are on the ancestral land of tribal nation. I will share with you the names of the people who were the first to live, celebrate, and sing upon the land where I am currently joining you from, including the Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, Miami, Sioux, Sauk and Fox, Kickapoo, and Peoria. The Sierra Club of Wisconsin reminds each of us to take the opportunity to learn about and appreciate the history of the land that we are on and the great historical, present, and future contributions of Indigenous people. It's also my pleasure to introduce the presenters for this evening. We have two outstanding national leaders from Sierra Club who I'm so excited could clear their schedule to join us, Bonnie Rice and Bradley Williams. Bonnie Rice has been with the Sierra Club for 13 years, working to protect wildlife and public lands. She started in the organizing department and moved on to campaigns. She mostly focused on carnivores and habitat issues in the Yellowstone and Northern Rocky region. Last year, she moved into a new position within the Conservation and Outdoors campaign as a National Wildlife Campaign Manager. And in that capacity, she works with and supports chapters around the country working on wildlife issues. And so we certainly appreciate that from Wisconsin. Bradley Williams is the Associate Director of Legislative and Administrative Advocacy for the Sierra Club's Wildlife and Lands Protection Campaign. He leads federal advocacy in DC for wildlife with a particular emphasis on protecting the Endangered Species Act and listed species. On a personal note, I had the opportunity to meet with both of them in person last month in Washington, DC, as we celebrated the Endangered Species 50th anniversary. And they are both outstanding champions for our wildlife. They're kind, passionate, and making it happen every day for us on a national level. I'm incredibly thrilled that they could join us, and I appreciate it very much. So with that, I will turn it over to Miss Bonnie Rice.
Okay, thanks, Amy. Thank you for that intro and for organizing the session tonight. I'm really glad to be here and want to thank everybody who's attending for sharing your evening with us tonight and really your interest in wolves and wildlife and in the Endangered Species Act. So why don't we go ahead and, yeah, Amy, if you want to advance the slide, and we'll just take a quick look at kind of the flow of the evening tonight. Okay, thanks. So yeah, first we're really going to talk about the Endangered Species Act, and as Amy mentioned, it's the 50th anniversary this year, so there's been a lot going on in Congress and with the Biden administration in terms of advocacy from the conservation community to really celebrate the success of the Endangered Species Act and its 50th anniversary, and to impress on our policymakers that we need the Endangered Species Act more than ever before, considering the rapid loss of species. And then we're going to talk a little bit about just the history of gray wolves and their protection under the Endangered Species Act, and then go into a little bit more of the action-oriented things that are happening now, both in Congress, legislative attacks, the pressure on the Biden administration in regard to asking for full funding for the Endangered Species Act and to really address the biodiversity crisis. And then have a little bit of time to talk about how you can help, and then have time for questions and answers. So that's just a brief flow for our hour together tonight. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. Okay, so as I mentioned, this is the 50th anniversary, and so the actual anniversary of the Endangered Species Act is December 28th. And so there's a lot that's being planned in regard to the actual anniversary. And one thing I wanted to mention with the anniversary is that 50 years ago, this was signed into law by President Nixon. And at that time, it was very bipartisan support for conservation and for the Endangered Species Act. We're not quite in that same situation now, but we need to get back there because obviously everybody needs and depends on the earth, for our survival as well. And we need all these species in an interconnected web of life. And so it really does need to be a bipartisan issue. And that's something that we're working a lot for within the Sierra Club. Next slide. And Amy, I think maybe there's just a little bit of delay. Let me see here.
It should have gone.
With the slides coming up. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I see it now. Okay. And this is a logo that was developed by the Endangered Species Coalition, and the Sierra Club is part of this coalition, along with several hundred other organizations that are really working on endangered species and the Endangered Species Act. And so this logo was made specifically for this year, and we're using this a lot in various ways, but in social media, on different things. You'll see in a coming slide that we had t-shirts made for the fly-in that we're going to talk about, that Amy is proudly wearing for Wisconsin. So, okay, next slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the Endangered Species Act, and I'm sure a lot of you are probably, very well aware of the Act, but this is, without a doubt, our most important law for protecting biodiversity. And it's important to remember, I think a lot of times when we think about the Endangered Species Act, we think primarily about wildlife, but it also is really important for protecting plants as well. And so we don't want to forget about those. The Endangered Species Act has been incredibly successful in its 50 years. It has saved 99% of the species under its protection from extinction. So without the ESA, we wouldn't have bald eagles, we wouldn't have grizzly bears, we wouldn't have gray wolves, peregrine falcons, the Tennessee purple coneflower, which you'll see in another slide coming up. And one of the biggest success stories is, of course, our national symbol, the bald eagle. And the bald eagle was saved from extinction by the Endangered Species Act. And so this year is just a really great opportunity to celebrate the success of the Act and to call for strengthening it and fully funding it. And that's what we're working on, both in Congress and with the Biden administration. And we know that our members really care about endangered species issues. They respond really well to our action alerts. We see that all the time, is that we get highest responses in regard to our alerts on endangered species. Next slide. I think, Amy, maybe I'll just pull them up also on my
Yeah, sorry about the delay.
laptop here. That's okay. It's on my end. So I'm traveling, everybody. So yeah, my connection is not great.
It gives us
So
time to look at the pretty pictures. Sorry, just to add. So they're so beautiful, the presentation. Thank you.
Well, and that is really Amy's work for sure, and her colleagues there. Yeah, it looks much better than the original. So I wanted to mention a couple of things about the Endangered Species Act. And these are only a few of the requirements that I thought were most important just to talk about tonight briefly. And the first one, of course, is that it's illegal to, quote unquote, take species that are protected under the ESA, or what we call listed species. And take is not just killing. It's all those other things that you see in the parentheses in regard to, it could be just harming, it could be pursuing endangered species, any of those things, harassment, hunting, or trapping, of course, are prohibited. Also, one of the most important things too with the Endangered Species Act is the two agencies that are charged with implementing the act, the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service. Yeah, I have a little typo there. Are required to really, when a species is listed, to evaluate what critical habitat is needed and to designate critical habitat for the species. Because we all know that if you're going to try and recover species and save them from extinction, they've got to have habitat. And that has to be protected from destructive activities. The next thing that I wanted to highlight, and Amy, you can go ahead and advance the slide now, since it takes a little bit, is consultation requirements for all federal actions that could jeopardize listed species or that could adversely modify or destroy the habitat that's been designated for those species. And so that's really important if you think about, for example, projects on national forest plans, logging projects, mining projects, any of those, there is a consultation requirement where the Forest Service or any federal agency would have to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service on the effects of the action that they want to implement in regard to whether or not it would affect endangered species or their habitat. So that is really, really important. So, I think the Endangered Species Act, one thing we want to talk about tonight is that, it's successful and it's more important than ever now, because I think as everybody knows or is really seeing, we are in a biodiversity extinction crisis. We are losing species at a much faster rate than ever before. We have the Endangered Species Act, and it has been very successful. But with the rate of development and habitat loss and climate change, we're seeing some very, very alarming and serious figures from various studies about the extinction crisis. And this is just one from NatureServe that's came out about a year ago in regard to what's happening in the United States specifically. And as you can see there, 41% of the ecosystems in the US are in danger of range-wide collapse. 40% of animals and 34% of plants are at risk of extinction. And so this is a crisis that we need to elevate to the same level as the climate crisis. And that's what we're calling on the Biden administration to do. The number one cause of extinction is habitat loss. Sometimes we hear about, a huge driver also, of course, is climate change, a driver of extinction, but the number one cause is habitat loss. So again, we need the ESA more than ever, and we need habitat protection. And so the Sierra Club is working to advance our 30 by 30 initiative, which means protection of 30% of the U.S. lands and waters by 2030, which is a midterm step to the nature needs half. And the movement started by the late biologist E.O. Wilson, where we need to conserve 50% by 2050. And so 30 by 30 is a mid step to that overall goal. We have to protect much more habitat in order to stem the extinction crisis. Next slide. And this is the Tennessee purple coneflower. See, I promised that you would all see that. So it's beautiful. We have this still because of the Endangered Species Act. And I wanted to spend a little bit of time just talking about the ESA at 50 campaign. And so if you remember, we had a slide previously with the logo on it. This is a coalition effort spearheaded by the Endangered Species Coalition. And we're doing various activities and lobbying and public awareness and engagement all throughout 2023. And so we'll talk about a few of these things a little bit more later, but just to briefly mention, we have two real prongs to this. One is pressure on the Biden administration, and the other is, of course, Congress. And so one of the things for the Biden administration that the coalition has done to really draw attention to the 50th anniversary of the ESA and the extinction crisis and the need to address it is sending a letter to the Biden administration just a couple of months ago. I'm really calling on the administration for a whole of government approach, similar to what the Biden administration is doing for the climate crisis, which is this whole of government approach in engaging all of the agencies, under the Biden administration to really take on the biodiversity crisis. And also, we want the administration to request full funding of the Endangered Species Act. Currently, implementation of the Endangered Species Act is only at about 50% funded. And so we really need to see a huge increase in the budget for implementation of the Endangered Species Act. And then the other parts that we're doing, one of the things that Amy mentioned that she participated, and also Jeanette here in the meeting tonight, participated for the Sierra Club representing the Wisconsin and Minnesota chapters in this fly-in. And so what we call a fly-in is when we and other organizations brought in activists from around the country to visit with their delegations and leadership on Congress to really take our message to DC, which is that we need the ESA. It's been an incredible success. We need it funded. We need you to address the biodiversity crisis. And, we needed to do that now. And so, yeah, it was great. It was wonderful to meet people from around the country, both within the Sierra Club and with a lot of our partner organizations, like Defenders of Wildlife and Earth Justice and others. And so I think it was just a really good grassroots effort. And so I really, again, want to thank Amy and Jeanette and all the participants, because they are the ones that really made it a success. Because you all are bringing that, on the ground knowledge and that grassroots advocacy that is so important in DC. It's one thing if I say something or Bradley says something, we are staff for the Sierra Club, right? So they hear from us a lot. But for people to come, from states around the country and use your own personal time to advocate is so important. And y'all did a great job. And Bradley, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I'll just kind of emphasize the points that you said. Constituent voices here in Washington are, in particular, extremely powerful and strong. They hear from folks like me who are doing advocacy on the Hill all of the time. But when you have people who are in the district that are actually represented by the members of Congress reaching out to them, it's particularly impactful. And I'll touch on this a little bit later, but this doesn't have to just be in Washington, D.C. It doesn't have to just be a fly-in into the nation's capital. You can do this at home too, in district, because when Congress is on recess, they're back in the district, and you can reach out to their district offices and talk to them, in particular about issues like the gray wolf, where there's some misinformation and misguidance about the science on this that some of your elected officials in the state, like Senator Baldwin, are pushing right now. So that's why your efforts are particularly important in this. Like in district advocacy and advocacy on the Hill from constituents is one of our most vital tools as the Sierra Club. We are a grassroots organization, and that's why we do things like this.
Great. Thanks, Bradley. And he will be talking more about some of those efforts that people were talking about when they came to DC in September, in terms of various bills, legislation, riders on appropriations bills, and then also our calls for a national biodiversity strategy. And that goes back to that whole of government approach. We need a national biodiversity strategy in order to really implement that. Next slide.
It's a Where's Waldo?
Okay.
If you can find, but no, that's.
And this is, yeah, so this is Sierra Club and our partners, activists from around the country that we were talking about. And yeah, you can see Amy and Jeanette in there. And those are the t-shirts that we had made specifically for this lobby effort. Next slide. So yeah, it was fun. It was over the course of a couple of days. There was ESA symposium that was put on as well, and some receptions on the Hill for members of Congress and their staff. So yeah, it was a great time had by all. Next slide. So now we're just going to talk a little bit about gray wolves. I know that's a big interest of people here tonight, and the Endangered Species Act, and just a little bit of the history of protection. And so before we do that, though, I just wanted to talk a little bit about just, why do we care about wolves? Why are they important? And I think we all know they're extremely controversial species, although they shouldn't be at all, but they are. And, just some of the values of wolves that, we think about, all of us, when we think about the species. And really, when I think about it, I think, wolves just have an inherent right to exist on the landscape. They have an inherent value. We don't have to justify, well, another value which you'll see there is, they are an economic driver for communities like, where I am around Yellowstone. But really, they just, they have their own inherent value, and they should be valued for that. They're like us in a lot of ways in terms of families and their pack social structure. When something happens to, one member of the pack, it affects the entire pack, just like it would for us. One of the most important roles that wolves play is really, that keeping that predator-prey relationship on the landscape and keeping natural systems in balance. We've seen a lot of studies in different places on that. Of course, Yellowstone is, premier in terms of studying wolves, and all of those relationships and the way they interact with other species and on the landscape, and keeping those systems in balance. They have tremendous cultural values, of course, for many people around the world. For many Native Americans and various tribes, huge importance in terms of cultural value. And they also are an economic driver in terms of communities where, people go to watch wolves. So that is, very important for those gateway communities. Next slide. So I think, yeah, we're just going to talk a little bit about the history of wolves. And there's been a lot. This is just part of the history in terms of the court decisions. As we mentioned, they are a very controversial species. They have been for a long time, but because of the Endangered Species Act, we actually still have wolves on the landscape. I think many people are familiar with just the history of gray wolves in terms of persecution for many, many decades. And we only had about 1,000 wolves in the lower 48 by the mid 1950s. Many populations were extirpated or were no longer present on the landscape directly because of human persecution. They were listed under the ESA in lower 48 in 1974. And then you can see there are a whole series of dates in terms of the back and forth with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and litigation, where they have gone back and forth between first being reclassified and downlisted in certain populations, and then delisted, relisted. For here tonight, I know folks are particularly interested in the Western Great Lakes distinct population segment. Delisted back in 2007, then relisted, and that has happened several times because of litigation. And, the courts siding with conservation organizations that litigated because the Fish and Wildlife Service was not taking various things into account in terms of their delisting proposals. And so then they were unlawful under the Endangered Species Act. Some of those things include, the failure to include the historical range of the gray wolf, the causes of human caused mortality, whether or not there are adequate state regulatory mechanisms to protect wolves if they're not protected under the Endangered Species Act anymore. All of these things are reasons why, the court decided with conservation community many times in terms of saying wolves still need federal protection. And so at the latest round, as I'm sure folks know, wolves were delisted in 2021 across the lower 48 states, except in the Northern Rockies, where they have been delisted for some time. And then we saw the courts relist wolves in 2022 in the lower 48. Next slide. And I would just add with that, Decision of Forest Sierra Club has been with our partners involved in litigation, for decades over gray wolves. And the big reason for that is because we feel that, they are not recovered. There are many, many places where there were historic populations where there's still adequate habitat, but wolves don't exist there and they never will. If they don't have federal protection. So these are just some current population estimates. And folks in the Great Lakes, you might have more updated information here, but this is what I found from the states in terms of their population estimates. Now, we all know that there are issues with the way states estimate wolf populations many times, and there can be controversy over those. This is kind of what's out there, what the states are saying exist on the landscape. And so as you can see, there are not that many, even in these the two biggest populations being in the Great Lakes and the Northern Rockies. Some in the Pacific Northwest, where they are recolonizing Eastern Washington and Eastern Oregon to some extent, but there's still vast areas where wolves have not moved, back into their historic habitat, and they still really need continued endangered species protections. Next slide.
I think it's over to me now. Thanks so much, Bonnie.
No, it is.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bonnie, for everything. I'm gonna hop into some stuff that's happening with Congress, the administration, and then some ways that you can help with gray wolves and the Endangered Species Act. So first, I'm going to start on the defensive side of things and kind of go through each bullet point here on the defensive and proactive side about what's happening in Congress and the administration. So right now in Congress, there are multiple bills that target the Endangered Species Act and specific species. Everything from changing a listing decision against science to bills that would handicap the entire Endangered Species Act. One that's in particularly relevant to Wisconsin is Senator Baldwin's Northern Great Lakes Wolf Recovery Act, which is not correctly named, as that would delist gray wolves in the Great Lakes region. So not something we want to see happen. And, you know, most of these bills, especially on the House side, have very little chance of passing on their own, but they're often either done as messaging bills to invigorate a base, or, as I'll touch on in just a moment, used to gain enough support to attach them onto must-pass annual legislation like the National Defense Authorization Act, also known as NDAA, or appropriations bills that fund the government that must pass every single year. And then on to the appropriations side, in my second bullet, there are currently 38 writers in the Interior Appropriations Bill and this year's appropriations bill on the House side that would target specific species and the ESA. And this is on its 50th anniversary. So we're seeing a historic number of riders being proposed. And one of the riders that's proposed would actually delist gray wolves federally. So all populations of gray wolves would be delisted if this rider was to be attached to an appropriations bill and pass. Riders are also known as earmarks commonly, and they are legislative vehicles that are attached to must-pass legislation, and they often benefit specific priorities that could not pass muster on their own. These bills could not pass through the House and Senate on their own, so they'll be attached to must-pass legislation so that they're able to get done and get member priorities passed. Recently, these riders in particular have been used to attack specific species proposed for listing or listed under the Endangered Species Act. Two of those riders that exist right now from past appropriation bills prevent the greater sage grouse from being listed and undid a listing decision with the North Atlantic right whale. So we're seeing really, impactful effects from these riders, and these are recent attacks that have happened. The sage grouse rider was attached to the 2014 appropriations bill, and the North Atlantic right whale rider was attached to last year's appropriation bill. So these are relatively new attacks on endangered species. Riders are not a new thing, but the attacks and gutting the ESA are. So we need to be very proactive in preventing these attacks from even getting proposed in the first place. And then my next bullet point is on something called CRAs. And this is a tool that Congress has under the Congressional Review Act, which is where the CRA acronym comes from. And these are legislative vehicles that can undo administrative decisions such as listing a species or changing their listing status. This year, we have already had 2 CRAs that have passed Congress, one on the northern long-eared bat and the lesser prairie chicken. Both of these passed Congress favorably and were then vetoed by President Biden, which we're really excited to see. And we did expect as well, because the decisions to list both of these species came from the Biden administration. So we would hope that they would veto these. But there is a possibility in the future, if enough support is gained, that Congress could undo a presidential veto. So we want to build up as much support as possible for the ESA and for species so that these CRAs aren't even proposed in the first place. Because one thing I want to emphasize is that any species could be at risk, including the gray wolf. So we need to stop these efforts before they even see the light of day. And one other point on the CRAs I want to emphasize is these are often supported by industry. So in the case of the northern long-eared bat, this was really supported by the logging industry. In the case of the lesser prairie chicken, this was really supported by the oil and gas industry. So we have, really powerful actors at play pushing these CRAs. So we need to be really proactive in fighting against industry, which is something the Sierra Club has done for a long time through our Beyond Coal campaign to our endangered species efforts. So it's really in, the culture of the Sierra Club to fight against industry that's really extractive of nature. So we need to continue those efforts going forward. And then onto the proactive side, there are some really great things happening. Bonnie mentioned biodiversity, and Representative Neguse of Colorado has introduced a resolution that calls on the Biden administration to develop a national biodiversity strategy. As a part of the UN treaty, the United Nations Treaty on Biodiversity, every nation on Earth except for the Vatican, North Korea, and the United States, strange bedfellows, I would say, have agreed to develop a national biodiversity strategy to address species loss globally. This resolution that has been introduced by Representative Neguse is symbolic. It would not force the administration to take any actions, but would show really strong support from Congress that this strategy is needed. And although it is unlikely we would be able to sign this treaty, one of the reasons we're not a part of the treaty is it takes 60 votes in the Senate. And as Bonnie mentioned at the beginning of our conversation today, conservation and species conservation is no longer really a bipartisan issue, and we need to build back up to that. So getting 60 votes in the Senate is a really hard thing to do these days. But even though we can't actually sign on to the UN Treaty on Biodiversity, we can still develop a strategy and a whole of government approach without being a party to this treaty. So one thing I want to emphasize in particular on this House resolution is that you can help with this. You can reach out to your House members, your House of Representative members, and ask them to join Representative Neguse's resolution. We'll share this around after, but the resolution is House Resolution 195. And currently, the only Wisconsin representative is Mark Pocan, who is signed on as a co-sponsor of the resolution. And, I want to emphasize that biodiversity is key to the survival of all life on Earth, and keystone species in particular are essential to preserving biodiversity. And the gray wolf is one of these species. So it's extremely vital that we not only prevent the gray wolf from being delisted while the population numbers aren't where they are, but that they're recovered to a level where they are thriving. Not just to a level where they're adequate to be delisted. We want to see gray wolves and other keystone species thriving. And then on to my next point on educating elected officials on the importance of the ESA. Like I mentioned earlier, we're seeing a lot of attacks on the Endangered Species Act. It's the 50th anniversary. We would hope that this year we would see, countless bills being introduced that would strengthen the ESA, not, weaken it, considering it's the most effective conservation law in the world. Like Bonnie mentioned, 99% of species that have been listed under the ESA have not gone extinct, which is an extremely powerful success story for this conservation law. And this is not something most countries have. Canada, for example, does not have an Endangered Species Act, and many other nations that neighbor us do not. So it's really important that we're a leader in this and are educating our elected officials like the US is in so many other ways. And one of the ways we do this is reaching out to our members of Congress, and in particular, the Sierra Club and our partners in the Endangered Species Coalition. We regularly meet with members of Congress. We'll hold briefings on the importance of the Endangered Species Act and on individual species. But as I mentioned earlier, a lot of these efforts can be replicated right at home in Wisconsin and in states across the United States. You can reach out to your elected officials, ask them to meet with you in district when your representatives are in district or your senators are in district, and tell them the importance of the Endangered Species Act. One of the ways you can do that is, sending information to them, like Senator Baldwin's wolf delisting bill. It's based off, outdated science. That's one of the main reasons she introduced this bill. So sharing the updated science with her and other co-sponsors of these bills is really important to make sure they have the most updated information. And when you hear that from constituent voices, it's extremely powerful. There's a lot of rhetoric in Washington and federally where, there's radical environmental groups like the Sierra Club or Earth Justice or all these people where we're have this reputation of being these people, but when you hear this from an actual constituent voice, whether you're a Sierra Club member or just an activist in the area, it's extremely impactful, and it adds to our efforts that we're doing federally. And you can advance to the next slide. And what's relevant now in the administrative side? So one of the great things that the Biden administration recently did was vetoing both of those Congressional Review Act, the CRAs that happened. The Biden administration has been pretty strong on species conservation and the Endangered Species Act, and we're really happy to see him veto both of those CRAs. And that's a defensive effort from the administration themselves. And we would hope that would happen, considering these decisions came from his administration. But we just need to emphasize and applaud the decisions that come from the Biden administration when they do make good decisions, because that makes them more likely to do this down the line. There are always political calculations to things, and with Biden going into a re-election year next year, any efforts that he makes on our issues, in particular species issues and wolf issues and any other conservation issues, applauding those efforts is extremely important, because it shows that they're popular and they're winning issues when they go to the ballot box in November. Another defensive effort that we do here at Sierra Club is litigating against bad listing decisions and administrative policies that happen. Sometimes U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does not complete accurate information when they're making a listing decision, and we can sue over that. We can enter into litigation against the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and provide details and science, and argue in a court where they did not do everything that they needed to do under the Endangered Species Act to make sure that this decision was fully informed by the proper science. And that is something that groups like Sierra Club and Earth Justice and other groups do quite regularly to make sure that the Biden administration and other administrations, whether that's the Trump administration or whatever administration might come next, is doing everything they can to follow the rule of law, which is the Endangered Species Act, and make science-informed decisions when they're making listing decisions or delisting decisions, which is particularly important. We don't want to see species delisted when their population numbers are not where they need to be to warrant a delisting decision. And then on the proactive side, one of the things that we've seen the Biden administration do and that we've been very strong advocates for is incorporating biodiversity and species conservation into any administrative decision making. Like I mentioned earlier, we want to see a national biodiversity strategy, which would essentially be a whole of government approach to conserving species. One example I want to give is most recently the Biden administration came out with an administrative rulemaking that would deal how the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, would deal with their public lands and land health. And one of the things that was particularly important in there in the proposed draft rule, and then the final rule hasn't come out yet. The Sierra Club submitted extensive comments along with other groups. We submitted 45 pages worth of comments, hoping they would become even stronger. But in this administrative rulemaking draft, one of the things they really emphasized was the importance of areas of critical environmental concern, which would conserve species like the sage grouse, which I mentioned earlier, cannot be listed under the Endangered Species Act because of an appropriations rider. So these ACECs can be designated and protect the species and ensure that their habitat is thriving and that their populations are strong, even though they can't be listed under the ESA. So even though, Congress may undercut the administration and the established law of the ESA, there are still things the Biden administration can do and future administrations can do to protect biodiversity through a whole of government approach. And this can be anything from the Defense Department, the State Department, to NOAA and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where we see more species work going on. And then the last proactive point I want to emphasize is making strong listing decisions under the Fish and Wildlife Service that are informed by science. Like I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we often are forced to do is litigate against the government, the federal government, because the decisions they're making are not properly informed by science. And one of the ways the Biden administration can be proactive and future administrations is making these decisions as strong as possible and not just going off of inadequate or outdated information. And we can do that by, doing outreach to Fish and Wildlife Service, doing outreach to your members of Congress who can also talk to Fish and Wildlife Service and make sure that they have the most up-to-date information as possible. These decisions are informed by science, so we want to make sure that they're following that and not just, taking political calculations into concern when these are decisions that need to be informed by science, because species biodiversity is essential to our way of life, is essential to everything from the plants that we grow, the crops that we eat, to, the habitats that we live in and the nature that we enjoy. So it's really important that strong listing decisions are made when a species is warranted for listing under the Endangered Species Act. And you can go to the, final slide. So some ways that you can help. One of the things that we can do is participate in Sierra Club action alerts. Often we will have these federal priorities that happen, like a CRA that happens, and we'll send out an action alert that will come to your email. And it's really easy to do. It's a really easy way to contact your elected official. All you have to do is type in your information and it'll populate who's your House of Representative member, who your senator is, and you can send them an email that we've already pre-written for you, and you can edit that email and make it, a really personal and powerful message to them. But it's a really simple and easy way to make your voice heard to your elected officials. And it's, very easy thing to do, I want to emphasize. And, they don't always have to come from National Sierra Club. They can also come from the Wisconsin chapter as well. There may be state priorities, or there may be a state action that needs to happen in your state legislature, or maybe even on the local level in your county council, or things like that, where you can make your voice heard. And that's even more impactful the more local you get. So, I think action alerts can kind of get lost in the shuffle sometimes, but it's a really simple thing that you can do to make your voice heard. And, you may think that, oh, my individual voice is not going to matter. But one of the things that are really important about these action alerts, and in particular with Sierra Club, where we're such a grassroots and power building organization, is that our voices amplify together. So, your voice isn't the only one being heard. There's hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of other people also lending their voices to this. So every little action counts. Another thing you can do is engage with your local media. I have letters to the editor written here, but building relationships with reporters, especially if you have a science background, is extremely important. You can provide information that may otherwise not be available to reporters if they're doing, a story on gray wolves, for example. And if Senator Baldwin introduced a bill, you can be someone that these reporters reach out to be a voice and inform their reporting, even if it's on background or if you're, actually being quoted in an article. You can also write letters to the editor or op-eds that respond to articles that you think, don't actually paint the full picture. That's another really important way that you can make your voice heard and amplify, the science that may not be, the full picture might not be there when these stories sometimes. And then the last, one I want to emphasize here is fostering relationships with your elected officials. I think this often, is not a commonly pushed out advocacy tactic, but attending fundraisers, even if you're giving $25 to go to a fundraiser for a senator, a state rep, a House of Representative members, consistently having your face shown, you'll build a relationship with that person, and they're more likely to listen to you down the line. Fostering relationships with your elected officials can really make your voice amplified even more. There are many examples of folks in the Sierra Club and other organizations nationally where they have, attended fundraisers for years and years and years. And I'm not talking about giving thousands of dollars and being a high dollar donor, but you can just give the minimum and have your face and, build a real, human connection with somebody who's an elected official, and then have a really powerful sway over that person. It doesn't have to be, we think of, these high dollar oil and gas industry folks giving thousands and thousands of dollars and buying plates of dinner. And certainly they have influence, but, having a personal relationship with somebody is sometimes even more powerful than the money that they give them. And so that's really important thing you can do that is often, I think, underemphasized in this. And I wanted to kick it over to Bonnie if she had anything to add on how you can help on this.
Thanks, Bradley. I think you hit on really a lot of the highlights, and I think, yeah, just that last one I would really emphasize as well. Those relationships with your congressional delegation and your local elected officials is really, really important. And also just, making your voice heard. And if you are interested in an issue, and there's something happening with it, to get it out into, your local paper, because in congressional offices or state legislators, they all track what's going on and, what the public is saying. And, that's something where you could get other folks to write letters to the editor too and create a little groundswell. That gets paid attention to, and that gets the issue out in front of a lot of other people, also who are looking at that media. So yeah, Amy, I think now maybe if folks had questions either about the Endangered Species Act or, what's going on right now in terms of Congress or the administration, or also just about gray wolves, listing status, that kind of thing. Or if you want to share some things, in terms of the processes that are going on, in Wisconsin with wolves, as far as the wolf management plan and things like that. So I'm happy to answer questions or go wherever you want to take it now.
Sure. I would give everyone, if you have an opportunity, if you're on your computer or your phone, you're able to put it in the chat, that's great. I'll read those out for Bonnie and Bradley. And I just want to press, because this is like on everyone's mind. In these national conversations that you're having, and Bradley certainly, on Capitol Hill, has there been any indication on what U.S. Fish and Wildlife is thinking about in terms of updates for the gray wolf early next year? We obviously are all holding our breath in Wisconsin, worried on what they might recommend.
I don't have any specific details right now. If I find out any more information, I will certainly share it with this group. And Bonnie, if you have anything to add, please do. But one of the things, I was emphasizing earlier, we always hope that the Fish and Wildlife Service will follow the best available science. And one of the things we can do, like I mentioned, if they aren't following the specific science, is enter into litigation with them. We don't want that to happen. We don't want to have to litigate. It costs everybody money. It costs everybody time. It delays, decisions and can further imperil the species when things are delayed. But, that is a tactic that we can use if these decisions come out and they're not following the science that we know is true. But Bonnie, anything to add on that?
Not a lot in terms of specific information. We hear that there's some kind of a national wolf strategy coming in, so the February-March timeframe. They're holding that very close to the chest in terms of the Fish and Wildlife Service and the director there in terms of what that might look like. We continue to impress upon them. One of the reasons that they've lost in court before that I mentioned earlier was because, one of the requirements under the Endangered Species Act is that there be adequate state regulatory mechanisms in place if wolves are delisted to protect and conserve the population. And so I'm sure everybody's very familiar with what happened in Wisconsin when wolves were delisted and the awful quote unquote hunt that occurred. Similar things happening in the Northern Rockies, national news with what happened to Yellowstone wolves in 2021. And so that's a really important factor that we keep in front of the Fish and Wildlife Service, is that, there are very hostile states that are implementing these regulations that do not protect wolves. And so that's why we need continued federal protection. But we don't really have specifics on what this national wolf strategy is going to look like, unfortunately.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I mean, we are, like you mentioned, in the midst of a huge wolf management plan and rule package approval. Like is happening next week in Wisconsin. And, I think it's a huge step forward, but what is always holding us back is the Act 169, the law in our state that literally requires that as soon as something is no longer federally protected, we hunt it aggressively as a game species. So it's just really, it's really scary what, can happen here in our state. So that's why we appreciate any intel you get and for keeping the pressure on at any level you can, because it is, that law is something that we obviously hope to change somewhere down the road, but it's a long time coming, unfortunately. So let's see here. I've got a question is, how is the ESA enforced and what are the penalties for violations? It seems poaching still occurs. And we know that obviously happens quite frequently in the Great Lakes area.
One thing I'll say on, what can happen if someone violates the Endangered Species Act is like, this is US law. It is a criminal offense to violate the Endangered Species Act. And if you are caught, I think there's, it kind of depends on what the specific violation is. There can be criminal and civil violations. I think in the criminal aspect, there are significant fines that can be levied against individuals or entities that violate the Endangered Species Act. And we've seen that in particular with companies who have violated things, in particular with oil and gas leasing in different areas in the US where they face significant fines. There's also the chance of imprisonment, actually, that can happen if it's a criminal violation of the ESA. But most of the time, if you're violating the Endangered Species Act, a fine is levied against you. And I think a lot of that, there's not specific monitoring by the Fish and Wildlife Service of every single individual species all the time, but a lot of that will rely on like citizen reporting and things like that. But the Fish and Wildlife does have a system to make sure that I think especially with corporations where we can see some of the biggest impacts on species occur, there is monitoring that occurs. I think a lot of the times, to give like specific examples, like when a construction site is happening and it's near habitat that might, have runoff to an area where an endangered frog species is, they're required to have an environmental impact expert on site to make sure that they're not, violating any of the laws and there's not runoff happening and things like that. But Bonnie, anything you want to add on that?
I would just say in regard specifically to poaching, then usually then there is an investigation that happens. The Fish and Wildlife Service often works with state officials on those types of, violations of the Endangered Species Act. And then, it depends what that investigation reveals. But then it can definitely lead to prosecution. And it has, and I've seen that specifically in recent years with grizzly bears.
Yeah,
but I think also, I guess I would just add that, that's why additional funding is needed for the Endangered Species Act in terms of actual implementation and monitoring and enforcement, as well as more money for, development of recovery plans and actually just getting species listed.
Yeah, I would like to underscore that. I mean, the fact that it's operating at like 50% below what it really should be for operating efficiently is a scary number. And I didn't know that before we did the flying. I didn't know that it was that underfunded. So that's a real wake-up call for me, and I'm sure an interesting fact for everyone. So thank you for underscoring that. We've got another question, and this definitely hits home for me, having just tried to persuade Senator Baldwin. And Ava, do you want to read it?
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead, read it aloud.
Many of us have written to Baldwin multiple times. What else can be done to impress upon her that her Wolf Recovery Act is
misguided? So what else can we do to get through to Miss Tammy Baldwin?
Great question. I think, even if Senator Baldwin, may not drop this issue, one of the things that we can do is reach out to other elected officials in Wisconsin and other states to make sure that they're not supporting this. I want to highlight an effort that Jeanette, who's on this call, just recently did in reaching out to Senator Klobuchar, who signed onto the act. And she had a really great conversation in person during our fly-in with Senator Klobuchar, and followed up with her by sending some updated science information, which Senator Klobuchar asked for, about, okay, I don't want to sign on to this if it's based on inaccurate science. And, Jeanette was able to provide that information. So making a policy extremely unpopular is something we can do. I don't think this bill has gotten much traction at all in this Congress. And even though, Senator Baldwin may not be dropping the issue, we can make it extremely unpopular among her colleagues in the Senate. And then in state as well, reaching out to other people in Wisconsin and making a groundswell of support come into her office. If the Wisconsin chapter or, folks involved with Wolf Awareness Week wanted to do a postcard party or a call-in or something like that to Senator Baldwin's office, just making sure that she's aware that this is an extremely unpopular policy. I'm not going to say that it's going to change her mind overnight, but, persistence is extremely important in these kinds of things. Legislative decisions happen over years, not months or days. So I think persistence is key. And even though Senator Baldwin may not drop her support of this bill or, unsubmit this bill on the first call, if you keep calling and keep calling and keep calling, and hundreds of other people keep calling all of the time, that's when you can see elected officials cave on things, especially if they're going into an election year, making an issue extremely unpopular. Like, at the end of the day, a lot of the considerations of many elected officials is being reelected because they want to continue representing the people in their state. So making an issue unpopular when it comes to the ballot box is really important and an impactful way you can get somebody to change their mind on an issue. In this case, Baldwin with the gray wolves.
And we had 3 from Minnesota. I was real proud to be with Bill Palno as well, who joined us from Sierra Club. And we had a Defenders of Wildlife participant as well, and a few others. And it's real important because Minnesota has one of the largest populations. And we know that some of these that want to delist the wolves, some of these people are saying that somehow Minnesota's population could travel across the country. Well, we need to keep our population here, and it isn't even that easy for them to travel. They like forested regions right now the most because of all the hunting. If it was safer, they might be more willing to venture out. But yes, we're going to stay proactive, and we were able to get Senator Smith to strongly commit that she had no interest in joining onto this bill. So we'll continue to keep the work up. And I did reach out to Gwen Moore's office, and she was willing to learn more about Joe Neguz's bill. I think what's happened, a lot of the shutdown activity and the chaos, some of the things that would normally be on their radar haven't gotten the priorities. So if we constituents and even those in this region reach out, we can have some leeway too, because they just know people are paying attention in their areas. I was born in Milwaukee, so I was able to call Gwen Moore and talk to her staff.
Yeah, thank you, Jeanette. It's been a pleasure connecting with Jeanette in Minnesota, who has been a huge help in trying to, like Bradley said, since Tammy Baldwin seems relatively unmovable on this, trying to make it unpopular for the senators in Minnesota, because if she's not able to get other senators in the Great Lakes area to essentially favor this, it's going to be a tough road. And hopefully this bill, I know that gives many of us angst, hopefully is really just not going anywhere. So and we'll follow up with Gwen Moore. Actually, I wrote down that she wasn't on the biodiversity House bill yet, and I immediately thought of her. So that will be a call that we follow up with for sure from the Wisconsin chapter. But yes, thank you for popping that in the chat, Bonnie. And
Yeah.
I know we're at time here. So what if it's all right here, what we'll do is if you have any other questions for Bonnie or Bradley, you can certainly send those in to me and we can get you to those two experts on the ESA. I really do appreciate the overview of the Endangered Species Act, sort of past, present, and future state of what that means for the gray wolf. So thank you very much. Thank you for the conversation in the chat. And, we'll all continue to work hard to really protect the ESA and hopefully get the funding that is needed to continue its work for the gray wolves and so many others. So thank you for that. For those of you joining us for the Wolf Awareness Week for the Wisconsin chapter, I know it's been a busy week. It's been fun, and we will continue this. Tomorrow, it's a little lighter. It's Friday, right? So everybody needs a little fun. We're going to be sharing an array of activities, how to make an origami wolf. We have some children's activities kind of for elementary level, if you have any in your life. I do. I lost my co-host here, but she has demonstrated. We have a coloring sheet that will be out there tomorrow. And so she's already pre-tested that for us. So that will be tomorrow. And then Saturday, we have Stream It Saturday. It will be a combination of looking at both wolves and beavers and their unique relationship and what these two keystone species really provide on the landscape. So that will be some movie recommendations for you to stream on your Saturday or your weekend. So certainly thank you all so much for being here. We appreciate it, and we will be in touch. So I will say with that, have a good evening. Thank you so much.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Night now.
Right. Thank you very much.